Roanoke Island, North Carolina, August 18, 1590. Governor John White steps off the boat after 3 years in England. The fort is still standing. The houses have been taken down, methodically, not in panic, no bodies, no blood, no sign of a fight, just one word carved into a wooden post, Croatoan. White will spend the rest of his life looking for those 117 English people. He will not find them. And for 400 years, the world has called this one of history's great unsolved mysteries, the Lost Colony of Roanoke, and built an entire cultural mythology around those 117 missing English men, women, and children. Here's the number that breaks that frame entirely. 300 to 500. That's the number of other people who vanished from this exact same coastline 4 years earlier, with 0 search parties sent after them, no theater built in their honor, no national park, no documentary series, no mystery designation at all. In 1586, 1 full year before Virginia Dare was born, 1 year before the famous colony even arrived, Sir Francis Drake's fleet pulled into Roanoke carrying human cargo that the standard Roanoke narrative has buried so thoroughly in footnotes that most people who've watched a dozen videos on this topic have never heard it mentioned once. A Spanish prisoner's account, studied in detail by historian David Beers Quinn, records the composition precisely. Approximately 300 indigenous women from Cartagena and roughly 200 Africans, Turks and Moors, people liberated from Spanish colonial ports, people who had been galley slaves, people who were promised freedom, and found themselves deposited on a North Carolina barrier island instead. When the English abandoned their first wave fort and sailed home with Drake, the ships were dangerously overcrowded. Between 100 and 400 of these people did not make it back to England. They stayed. And then they also vanished. This isn't just ancient history. This is in your DNA right now. If you have family roots in the Carolinas, Virginia, or the Appalachian Corridor, what I'm about to show you may be the moment you've been waiting for without knowing what you were waiting for. If you've ever actually wondered where you come from, not the family story, but the real biological answer, subscribe. Because what comes next goes deeper than most people are willing to go. History gave one disappearance a name. The DNA did not observe that editorial choice, and the DNA has been keeping its own record for 400 years, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The question was never, what happened to the English? The question, the one the DNA actually answers, is who decided only the English were worth looking for? Before we go any further, drop a comment. Before watching this video, did you know that hundreds of African, Moorish, and Turkish people arrived at Roanoke before the famous 1587 colony and also disappeared? Just yes or no. And if you have family roots in the Carolinas or Appalachia, say that too. Because I mean this, your DNA may be part of this story. And that matters to what comes next. The mystery that was officially designated America's greatest unsolved has a living answer. It's been walking around Robeson County, North Carolina this whole time. The state of North Carolina recognized them in 1885 under a name they chose themselves, Croatoan, the same name carved in that post. Then the state renamed them, then renamed them again. Today, they're called the Lumbee, 60,000 members, the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River, and their DNA should have settled this decades ago. The Lumbee Tribe DNA project at FamilyTreeDNA has data from over 2,700 registered tribal members. Of the men tested, only 8 carry a Native American Y chromosome haplogroup. 8 out of thousands. The dominant male lineage is something called RV88, a subclade concentrated in southeastern Europe, documented among both Sephardic Jewish and Ashkenazi populations, and almost entirely absent from purely indigenous North American genetic profiles. The maternal lines show 121 sub-Saharan African samples alongside 20 Native American lines, and yet, the data said the exact opposite of what the textbooks said it should. This is not a tribe that absorbed a few European settlers over the centuries. This is a profile that points to a founding event, a specific convergence of populations in a specific time and place that created something entirely new. The genomic fingerprint of that event is still legible in living people 400 years later. Roberta Estes is a computer scientist who spent over a decade building the Lost Colony DNA project, cross-referencing English families, tribal members, and Eastern North Carolinian descendants, trying to find the match that would close the case. What she found in the Lumbee data wasn't just European admixture layered onto a Native American base. It was something more structurally different than that. Something that pointed not to gradual mixing, but to a triracial founding. English, Algonquian, and something else. Right at the moment, the standard history says of 117 English, people walked into the trees and disappeared. Then there's the archaeology. Mark Horton, an archaeologist at the University of Bristol, spent years excavating Hatteras Island alongside local researcher Scott Dawson. And they found something that no purely Native American settlement should contain: buckets of hammer scale, microscopic iron shavings, the byproduct of blacksmithing, a technology completely absent from pre-contact Croatoan material culture. You don't find hammer scale in a village unless someone is working iron. And the only people on that coastline who knew how to work iron were English, which means English iron workers were living in that Croatoan village, not briefly, for decades. And the people who carry their DNA, and the DNA of everyone else who converged on that coastline, are the Lumbee, still there. Still named after the river, still waiting for a history that matches what their genome has always said. The complexity begins in 1586, not 1587. Every Roanoke story starts with 1587, the year the famous colony arrived. But the date that actually matters, the one that changes the genetic calculation entirely, is the year before. Because in 1586, before Virginia Dare's parents had set foot in the New World, Sir Francis Drake's fleet had already been there, and it had left something behind. David Beers Quinn spent his career at Queen's University Belfast doing what most historians weren't willing to do with the Roanoke story: reading the Spanish sources. A deposition taken from a Spanish prisoner captured by the English and later released on Cuba describes the composition of Drake's fleet in specific terms: 300 indigenous women from Cartagena, mostly. 200 Africans, Turks, and Moors doing, as the document puts it, menial service. Drake had raided Cartagena, sacked St. Augustine. His ships were dangerously overcrowded when he pulled into Roanoke to pick up the stranded first-wave English colonists. When those colonists chose to cut their losses and sail home, there was no room for everyone. Between 100 and 400 of Drake's captives were left on that island. This discovery was made decades ago. Almost nobody talks about it, until now. Here is the timeline that the standard Roanoke narrative doesn't show you. In 1586, a population of Moorish, African, Turkish, and South American people arrives at the Croatoan coastline. Some free, some still enslaved, most with no clear legal status at all, and makes contact with a Croatoan tribe that has already had 2 years of complex, sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative dealings with English expeditions. By 1587, when the famous colony arrives, the Croatoan population on Hatteras Island may already have been demographically changed. What the 1590 search party found, an empty English fort and the word Croatoan carved into a post, may have been the end of a story that started not in 1587 but in 1586. Fred Willard, director of the Lost Colony Center for Science and Research until his death in 2016, said it plainly in one interview: "We can't prove they died." He wasn't talking about the English colonists. He was talking about the Africans, Moors, and Turks Drake left behind. It was one of the few times a mainstream Roanoke researcher acknowledged the second disappearance on record. Think about what that means. 2 groups of people vanished from the same coordinates in the same decade. One group gets a national park and 4 centuries of investigation. The other group gets a footnote in a book about someone else. And both groups, it turns out, may have the same descendants. What families know, in this case, is what the ground remembers. Scott Dawson grew up on Hatteras Island. He's not an academic by training. He runs a museum there, dedicated to the Croatoan people whose land it was long before anyone called it a mystery. He started excavating in 2009 with local volunteers, and eventually brought in Mark Horton from the University of Bristol to run the archaeology properly. What they've pulled out of the ground over 15 years is not ambiguous. Copper rings, sword handles, writing slates, the kind English schoolchildren used, glass beads, fragments of 16th century English pottery, and the hammer scale, tiny iron shavings barely larger than grains of sand, found in quantity, intermixed with the everyday material culture of the Croatoan village, not in a separate English section of the site, woven into it. Horton said it clearly. This is showing a presence of the English working metal and living in the Indian village for decades, not visiting, not trading, living. But here's where it gets strange, because Dawson goes further than the archaeology. He says the lost colony was never lost at all. His exact words, spoken publicly at the Roanoke River Maritime Museum. The Lost Colony is a marketing campaign that started in 1937, and it created this myth of a colony that vanished, and none of that is real. The colonists wrote on their own fort that they were going to Croatoan. John White's journal confirms they had a plan to relocate there. The word on the post wasn't a cryptic clue, it was an address, and nobody went to check. A hidden symbol on a 1585 map, discovered when researchers held it under backlighting at the British Museum, pointed to a second location 50 miles inland in Bertie County, North Carolina. where the first colony foundation has since excavated 16th century English pottery fragments, which means the colony didn't just go to one place. It split. Some went to Hatteras, some went inland, and all of them, it now appears, merged into existing native communities and kept going. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, born August 18, 1587, her grandfather John White's granddaughter, is the named symbol of this story. If she survived, she didn't survive as an English girl living in an English settlement. She survived as a member of a Croatoan community that was already, by the time of her birth, a place where more than two peoples had converged. Her living descendants, if she has any, and the DNA suggests someone does, carry a genetic profile that looks nothing like the racial categories her name was later used to defend. American identity was being written genetically on the Carolina coast across a 4-year window, 1586 to 1590, written by people who had no say in whether they'd be there, and that genetic writing is still legible today. Back in the 1970s, researchers were already getting signals they didn't quite know how to read. HLA typing, a method of immunological profiling used before modern DNA sequencing existed, found that the Lumbee had unusually low frequencies of a marker called HLA-B40. It's common in most Native American populations. It's rare in European ones. At the time, nobody had a clean explanation. Now they do. When Roberta Estes published her analysis in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy in 2009, she identified something in the Lumbee's distribution of European haplogroups that wasn't consistent with gradual colonial-era mixing. The European male lineages weren't evenly distributed across the population the way you'd expect from centuries of intermarriage with English settlers. They were concentrated, founding event concentrated, and the geographic spread of these lineages from eastern North Carolina up through Robeson County and into the Appalachian Corridor mapped precisely onto the hypothesized dispersal path of the Roanoke-era coastal populations. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. The Lumbee aren't a Native American tribe that absorbed English colonists. The genetic evidence, taken seriously, points to something more structurally fundamental than that. The Lumbee are what the genetic merger of English settlers, Croatoan people, and the unnamed populations Drake left behind looks like 400 years later. They are the event, not a record of it. The event itself, still living. And in 1701, an English explorer named John Dawson traveled through the Carolina interior and met Hatteras Indians who told him their ancestors were white people and could talk in a book. He wrote it down. It has been in the historical record ever since, 300 years of documentation. And the Roanoke researchers who came after Dawson largely filed it under legend. The DNA filed it under confirmation. Here's the part nobody talks about. The Lumbee have 60,000 members. Their founding haplogroups have been dispersing through marriage and migration for 14 to 16 generations. That means the genetic signal from this coastline, from those 4 years between 1586 and 1590, does not live only in federally recognized tribal members. It lives in family trees across North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, West Virginia. It lives in people who have no idea it's there. If you have roots in any of those states, the question of whether you personally carry a trace of this event is not a metaphor. It's a real question. And modern DNA testing is the first tool in history that can actually answer it. Convergence, the moment when populations meet, merge, and one of them loses the right to be named, happened on the Carolina coast in 1586. But the mechanism wasn't invented there. The people Drake brought to Roanoke had already lived through a version of it. The dominant male lineage in the Lumbee DNA project, RV88, a subclade of RM269, isn't simply European. It's specifically concentrated in southeastern Europe, the Western Balkans, present-day Croatia and Bosnia, and it appears in elevated frequencies in Sephardic Jewish communities. The descendants of Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 who dispersed across the Mediterranean and, eventually, across the Atlantic. Here is what happened in 1492. A population was expelled from Spain, told their identity had no legal standing, absorbed into other communities. Their history reclassified as footnote. Their children grew up with surnames that matched the country that rejected them, and genetic memories that matched a world that no longer officially existed. Here is what happened in 1586. A population was transported across the Atlantic by an English privateer, left on a barrier island with no legal status, no citizenship, no history the arriving English ships were required to record. Absorbed into a coastal Algonquian community, their history reclassified as footnote in someone else's mystery. I'm not going to draw that parallel for you. You can already see it. What Roberta Estes flagged in the Lumbee haplogroup data is the possibility that some of Drake's so-called Moorish captives, the ones Spanish colonial records described as taken from the ports of Cartagena and St. Augustine, may have been converso descendants, people of Jewish or Moorish origin who had been converted forcibly to Christianity under the Inquisition, then displaced across the Atlantic, then deposited on a North Carolina island. Their erasure from the official record was by 1586, already 94 years old. And yet there is a subclade in the Lumbee Y chromosome data pointing back toward exactly those populations. There are three things this tells us simultaneously. First, the genetic history of the Carolina coast was multiracial before the English even called it a colony. Second, the specific populations converging there in the 1580s were themselves products of prior erasure events. They arrived pre-erased. Third, the wrong villain in the Roanoke story was never the Croatoan, never the Powhatans, never hostile Native American resistance. The thing that turned a multiracial convergence into a mystery was a framing decision. Someone decided to ask about the English. Nobody asked about anyone else. In 1885, North Carolina officially named the Lumbee the Croatoan Indians, acknowledging the Croatoan heritage in their own name. In 1911, the state legislature renamed them Indians of Robeson County. In 1952, they chose their own name. 3 name changes in 67 years, each one moving them further from the historical event their DNA still records. The naming was doing what the history books were doing, classifying people into categories that didn't require a mystery. I want to pause here for a second, because what I'm about to show you in this next section connects directly to something we covered in our last episode, where we tracked another population whose genetic memory outlasted the written record meant to erase it. Drop a comment which community from that episode stayed with you, because the structure of what happened to them and what happened to the Lumbee is the same. Different continent, same mechanism. And once you see it in one place, you see it everywhere, English. What that word meant in 1587 to the people who used it was the same thing the word lost meant in 1590 to the people who came looking. It was a category. And categories tell you who gets a search party. In 2019, a team at 23andMe led by Katarzyna Brick published a study in PLOS Genetics examining patterns of Native American genetic admixture across the continental United States. They weren't looking at Roanoke, they were mapping population history. And what they found in the genomic profiles of non-tribal European and African American descendants in eastern North Carolina was a concentration of Native American ancestry that can't be explained by post-colonial contact. The timing is wrong, the location is right. The signal maps to a specific coastal zone, a specific decade, a founding event the study doesn't name. It doesn't need to. Only one founding event fits those coordinates and that timeline. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what the standard framing had always implied. The Roanoke colony was not uniquely English. Sir Francis Drake deposited between 300 and 500 enslaved Moorish, African, Turkish, and South American captives at Roanoke Island in 1586, making the first durable genetic event in permanent American colonial history a multiracial one. And the mystery of the lost colonists has always been, at its foundation, a story about whose disappearance a civilization decides to investigate, and whose it explains away as a logistical detail. Let that sit for a second. Virginia Dare, born August 18, 1587, became, in the early 20th century, a white nationalist icon. Her name appeared in anti-immigration literature as a symbol of original Anglo-American identity, the first English child born in the New World, held up as a founding type. The people most likely to carry her actual genetic legacy today are the Lumbee, a people who carry sub-Saharan African maternal haplogroups, Southeastern European paternal lineages, and traces of Algonquian ancestry. A people whose founding event included hundreds of Moorish and African men and women who arrived the year before Virginia Dare was born. If she survived, and the DNA suggests someone did, her living descendants would fail the racial categories her name was used to defend. The genomic record is not cruel about this. It doesn't editorialize. It just shows what actually happened. And what actually happened is that the first Americans were already more than one thing before the category American existed. What the mystery was always about was never about the colonists. It was about who gets to be lost, who gets to be found, who counts enough to be called missing. The DNA doesn't ask those questions. The DNA just counts everyone. The mark it left is visible in the historical record long before the DNA confirmed it. John Dawson wrote it down in 1701. Hatteras Indians telling him their ancestors were white people and could talk in a book. That's not a legend invented to claim English heritage. That's a memory. An oral transmission that had already been running for over 100 years when Dawson heard it. He wrote it down and moved on. The world filed it under folklore. In 1885, North Carolina state commissioners documented it. In the early 20th century, anthropologists documented it. The Lumbee, the Hatteras, the Roanoke Hatteras tribal community, they all said the same thing across 2 centuries of documentation to people who mostly didn't believe them. We came from those people on the island. Our grandmothers knew our names matched the names on that manifest, and the DNA said, you were right. Roberta Estes spent over a decade building the forensic genealogical case. One of the strongest threads runs through a surname, Berry. 2 men listed on the 1587 Colony Manifest, Henry Berry and Richard Berry. In the 1730s, a man named Henry Berry appears in land records in what is today Robeson County, North Carolina. His descendant Priscilla Berry Lowry is documented passing down the oral tradition of Lost Colony descent. When Estes tested Y chromosome DNA from Berry family lines in England alongside Berry lines from Robeson County, she found convergence consistent with a shared 16th century ancestor. That is not confirmation. It needs ancient DNA from the site to be confirmation, and that material hasn't been successfully extracted yet. But it is the closest forensic genealogical match this case has produced, and the oral tradition got there first. Everything I just told you, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. The entire framework of Roanoke research operated on a specific assumption. The assumption was that the Lumbee and Hatteras oral traditions were the unverified claims, the things that required scientific proof before anyone took them seriously. The DNA evidence inverts that. The oral tradition was the accurate historical record. The written record, the one that called this a mystery for 400 years, was the document that needed correcting. What does it mean when the people the history books dismissed as unreliable narrators turn out to have been the only ones telling the truth? What does it mean when the mystery was only a mystery because the people who knew the answer weren't the people anyone was asking? And there's a political dimension to this that isn't historical at all. The Lumbee Tribe's bid for full federal recognition was blocked in the U.S. Senate as recently as 2022. The arguments against recognition have shifted across decades, but the underlying logic has returned to the same place again and again. The Lumbee's mixed ancestry makes their tribal identity legally ambiguous. The very DNA that confirms their connection to the Roanoke event, the European haplogroups, the multiracial founding profile, has been used as a reason to question whether they qualify as Native American. 400 years after the event, the same framing that turned their ancestors into a footnote is still doing its work in federal hearings. A DNA extraction kit on a wooden table. Afternoon light through a window. That's the image I keep coming back to when I think about this story. Not the fort, not the carved post. Not John White standing on an empty beach in 1590, trying to understand where his family went. The kit on the table. The question it contains. The answer it's been possible to get for less than 20 years, after 400 years of the wrong people being asked. The genetic fault line this episode has mapped is still active. The Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina, 60,000 members, the largest tribe east of the Mississippi, was offered full federal recognition by the U.S. House of Representatives in 2024. It was blocked in the Senate. The people the Roanoke event created are still today fighting the system that classified that event as a mystery about other people. Before I give you the last thing, I need you to sit with this for a moment. If you are watching this with family roots in the Carolinas, Virginia, Tennessee, West Virginia, or anywhere along the Appalachian corridor, what I've described in this video is not a closed historical event. The Lumbee are 60,000 strong. The Melungeon communities of Appalachia number in the tens of thousands. 14 to 16 generations of dispersal means the founding haplogroups from this coastline are now carried by a population far larger than any single tribe or community. The DNA kit on that table is not a historical document. It is a live transmission from 1586 addressed to whoever opens it. If this episode changed how you think about whose story Roanoke actually is, subscribe and share it. There are more episodes in this series built on the same question. The answer keeps being the same people nobody counted. The Roanoke colony was never lost. It was reclassified. And the people it became are still waiting. In federal hearing rooms, in DNA databases, in land records and oral traditions stretching back 300 years, for the history that their genome has always been telling to finally be treated as history.